Hi, it's Ronald the Rules Lawyer, and my coverage of the new classes continues in the Impossible playtest, which is what Paizo is calling this playtest that runs through January 31st. In my last video, we covered the Necromancer, someone who summoned thralls to fill the battlefield, and in today's video, I'll cover the Runesmith, which I've heard some people describe as a support martial, but I would call it a hybrid martial caster, somewhere in between, and it gives off Magus vibes. First, I want to toot my own horn, which I've always thought sounded kinky, but I think I've been forecasting the design of these two new classes. After I covered the new exemplar class, the mythical hero class, I made this post on the Pathfinder subreddit titled "The Exemplar, the Kineticist, Spellcasting, quote-unquote, without spell slots, and the Continuing Influence of D&D 4e." I'm just going to leave this as food for thought for now. I'm going to expand on it in my final thoughts at the end, and I'll also have a link to this post in the video description. But first, let me introduce myself. I am Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I am a lawyer who runs tabletop role-playing games. My preferred system is Pathfinder 2e. I ran an after-school middle school class for 7 years. Support my Patreon. I don't make money as an attorney. For more info on why, look at the video whose thumbnail is on the screen. Supporting my Patreon gives you ad-free early access to most of my videos and exclusive content. Alright, let's go over the Runesmith class. First, here's a couple of pieces of artwork. There's one, and here is the other. And the Runesmith, their features are kind of a hybrid of casters and martials. On the one hand, they have proficiencies with weapons that are like martials. They get expertise at level 5, mastery at level 13. Similar progression with their armor. However, their class DC, which is used to determine the difficulty of avoiding their runes' effects, progresses at the same levels that spellcasting does. Becomes expert at level 7, master at level 15, and legendary at level 19. You are trained in martial weapons as well as medium armor, like a martial character. However, your key attribute is intelligence, and you gain only 8 hit points per level from your class. Your high intelligence means you have a good number of skills, and you are automatically trained in crafting and one of the 4 magical tradition skills. The text here emphasizes that you are not a practitioner of magic, rather you are a humble scholar. Sure, you don't cast spells like casters, however, what you do is magical, as we'll see. The main thing you do, obviously, from the name is you apply runes to things and trigger them. Runes are various magical effects that you can apply to items or to creatures. How runes work is very reminiscent of the D&D Artificer, which can infuse items. However, you have more flexibility. You can trigger powerful effects with your runes, and you can reapply them throughout the day. And you can apply them to creatures, including in the middle of combat. I like to think of runes as magic bombs that can go off at your command, but they don't necessarily have to do damage. Also, they can have a passive effect before you trigger the bomb. There are 2 ways you can apply them. You can etch them, or you can trace them. Etching is the more permanent thing that you can do. You do this in exploration mode, either during your daily preparations or with a 10-minute activity. You can etch any number of runes up to your maximum when you do so, and at level 1 you can sustain up to 2 etched runes at a time. This lets that creature or the item benefit from the passive benefit of that rune. If you etch a 3rd rune, then your oldest one fades. You can also trace runes, which only takes 1 or 2 actions, however they only last until the end of your next turn. You can trace the rune on an adjacent target with 1 action, and I think that includes yourself, although that's not spelled out, or with 2 actions on a target that's up to 30 feet away. There's no limit to how many runes you can trace, however each rune only lasts until the end of your next turn, so there's a natural limitation on how many you can have at once. Notably, very important, you must have a hand free or be holding an artisan's toolkit, and it has the manipulate trait. This has some big implications on your character, which I'll cover later. The 3rd key thing you can do with runes is invoke them. You can invoke 1 or more of your runes. You can invoke multiple runes at once, so long as they're within 30 feet of you. It then blazes with power, applying the effect in its invocation entry. After that, it then fades away. No creature can be affected by multiple copies of the same specific rune. Also, in the invocation trait, it says you must be able to speak clearly and in a strong voice. I'm assuming the intent is that this does not work in a zone of silence. However, I don't see the auditory trait here. But that's also true with all spellcasting, and it's generally accepted that if you're deafened, you still have to do a DC 5 flat check when casting spells in Pathfinder. Anyway, a hidden interaction, which I think could be clearer if that is the case. So the idea here is that you can have 2 runes that you can prepare in advance of an encounter. Maybe you enjoy their passive effect and don't want to have to keep tracing them over and over again. Or you simply want to not have to trace them to prepare the bomb part. Regardless, if you invoke one or both of them during an encounter, you probably want 10 minutes afterward to etch runes again. Some more general, relatively boring stuff, but necessary to go over about runes. If they require a saving throw, they use your Runesmith class DC. Also, runes are magical effects, and every rune has one of the 4 traditions. The rune itself, and we're going to go over them, might have one of the 4 magical tradition traits. And if it doesn't, you need to confer one of the traits to it with a skill that you are at least trained in. In addition to the normal reasons why you'd want to know the magical tradition of a given rune, there are a number of class feats that care about this. Interestingly, you can etch or trace a rune that must be occult even if you're not trained in occultism. This requirement only applies if the rune doesn't have a trait already attached to it and you want to make it occult. Also, runes, while they're not spells, they can be treated like spells sometimes. For example, if you're affected by a polymorph effect that prevents you from casting spells, you cannot etch or trace runes. You also can't invoke runes, however, you can still benefit from a rune's effects. Also, effects that protect against spells likewise protect against runes. At level 1, you learn 4 runes. They're added to your runic repertoire, and you can sustain up to 2 etched runes. These numbers go up as you level up. Every odd-numbered level, you get to add a new rune to your repertoire, and every 4 levels after the first, you get to sustain another etched rune. We'll get to the runes later, however, most of them are level 1 runes, and some of them are level 9 runes, and a couple are level 17 runes. You, of course, can only learn a rune of your level or lower. There's no language here about switching out old runes. I don't know if that was an oversight. Classes normally are able to easily change one of their choices at a level up. At least choices like these. The last class feature the Runesmith gets is the Shield Block General feat, which is interesting because you can trace runes only if you have a free hand. And there's a number of runes and feats that presume or work well with you wielding a weapon. Because tracing runes requires a hand committed to it, it seems like you need to make a choice between whether you're wielding a shield and using this shield block feat or wielding a weapon. Also, shields can be used as weapons in Pathfinder, however, they're not as effective as other weapons at being weapons. This sounds restrictive, however, I think we'll see that this class might be strong enough. There's some more features that they get as they level up, relatively minor in the grand scheme of things. Runic Crafter gives you the magical crafting skill feat, letting you craft magical items, and you automatically know the formulas for the fundamental runes, for weapons and armor, and for shields. And you also don't need a formula book. It's nice to be able to craft magical items, and this is kind of leaning into the artificer flavor of the class. However, beyond that, access to formulas isn't a big deal. They're usually really cheap. And crafting has been changed in the remaster, where it just saves you a little time. Runesmiths do not get the weapon specialization ability. They get this similar ability called runic optimization. They get bonus damage to their strikes that is not keyed off of their proficiency. It relies on the fundamental runes of the weapon itself. The scaling and the advancement is similar, but not exactly the same as, say, a typical martial class. At level 9, they get Assured Runic Crafter, which means that when they craft a permanent rune, they get to treat their craft check as 1 degree of success better. Now, this is only important in a small minority of campaigns where you don't have access to a market to get permanent runes, or you have extensive downtime to save money via crafting. Alright, but you're probably dying to see what the actual runes do, which is the meat of what this class does. As I go through the runes, I'm going to bring up some issues I have, and I want to first preface this section by saying I like the class. You get this feeling of interweaving magic with steel without having to worry about spell slots. However, there's a number of ambiguities in the text, questions I have, and some balance concerns that I'll bring up as I get to them, with a few examples at the very end. As I normally do in one of these videos, I'm not going to go over every single thing here. I'll cover highlights that give a good sense of how this class operates and the build choices that you're making when you build the class. I do go over the full list of runes and feats in the bonus video for my patrons. First, I want to point out that every rune has a cool name, in addition to a descriptive name. Also, some runes are diacritic runes. They affect other runes. So if you're tracing them in combat, you need another action to trace this onto the base rune. They also have syllables attached to them, a prefix that you can add to the main name, which I think is cool. The first rune is Atral, the rune of fire. You draw it on a creature or object. Now, you can do this on an enemy, and when we look back at the trace action, you see that no check is required. They let you draw it on them. Of course, they don't really. It's just the game doesn't have you make a check, and I guess you just do it from a distance. This reduces the bearer's fire resistance. Oh, someone who bears a rune on them is a rune bearer. Their fire resistance is reduced by 6. When you invoke this rune, the bearer takes 2d6 fire damage and does a basic fortitude save. If they critically fail, they're dazzled for 1 round. The damage scales up as you level up naturally. So if you're adjacent to a foe, you can spend 1 action to trace a rune on them, and then if you invoke it before the end of your next turn, before your traced rune expires, you can do this damage. If the target has fire resistance and you have an ally who does fire damage, you might want to wait until your next turn to invoke it, which you can do so long as you're within 30 feet. The next rune is Esvadir, the rune of whetstones. This is another offensive rune, however it's applied to a piercing or slashing weapon, or unarmed strike. Note that this is not limited to melee weapons, this can be a bow. Its passive effect is to deal an additional 2 persistent bleed damage per weapon damage die to foes. If you invoke it, the essence of sharpness is released outward from the rune, dealing 2d6 slashing damage to a creature adjacent to the rune bearer, and that calls for a basic fortitude save. Next is Ulgenex, the rune of Coward's Bane. You put this on a shield, and it gives the bearer a +1 status bonus to AC against physical ranged attacks, which sounds strictly weaker than the previous shield one, however its invocation ability seems quite good. It creates an illusion in the minds of all adjacent creatures for 1 round of a large impassable wall blocking all paths away from the rune bearer. They cannot willingly move away from the rune bearer for a round until they disbelieve the illusion, which requires an action and a check. Now, I'm going to cheat and jump ahead a little bit here and point out that there's a level 2 Runesmith feat that works well with this called Fortifying Knock, which is an action compression feat that lets you with a single action raise your shield and trace a rune on your shield. If you use that and invoke this, you can easily stick enemies to you and defend yourself if you have that feat with this. Next is Pluna, Rune of Illumination. You put this on a creature or armor and make them glow like a torch, 20 feet of bright light, dim light for the next 20 feet. All creatures have a penalty to stealth checks in the area. Also, when you invoke it, every creature in the light, so within a 40-foot radius, must do a fortitude save or become dazzled for a round. This affects allies too, and I don't know if that's intended. Maybe because imposing dazzled can be quite a strong effect. But yeah, it being a huge area and not being able to exclude allies, that combination, I don't know if that's ideal here. Alright, we now move on to the level 9 feats, a tier above. First is another diacritic rune. It's N, the diacritic rune of expansion. You apply this to a rune that deals damage. You make it so that when it's eventually invoked, its damage applies in a 15-foot burst centered on the rune bearer. Just a minor complaint here, a burst centered on the rune bearer usually center bursts on the corner of a square, so I don't know where exactly it's centered. Also, they're subjected to the damage as well as the base rune's effects. So I assume that means the fire rune's reduction in fire resistance applies to the damage here. But does this also mean that the lightning one means that they have to do a move action on their turn or take electricity damage? It's not clear to me exactly what base rune's effects is and how you adjudicate them in every case. Next is Fakris, Rune of Gravity. This one makes someone a better wrestler. They get a +2 item bonus to athletics checks, and they gain the benefits of the Titan Wrestler feat. The invocation is cool. All creatures within 15 feet must do a fortitude save or be pulled 5 feet towards the rune bearer, 10 feet on a critical failure. This affects all creatures, allies and foes of that rune bearer. You actually might want to apply it to a foe if you want to get all of your allies closer to it when their turn starts. Next is Ichelsu, Rune of Observation. When drawn on a creature, they get the effects of See the Unseen, formerly called See Invisibility. It also lets you see ghosts within objects and gives you a bonus against illusion effects. They also gain all-around vision, so they cannot be flanked. When this rune is invoked, eyes of the rune fly outward in a 20-foot emanation, and every creature within, if they were invisible, they become concealed, and if they were concealed, they no longer are concealed. This lasts 2 rounds. Next is pretty cool, I like it. It's Juraz, the Rune of Dragon Fury. You etch this onto a creature or armor. Whenever someone strikes the rune bearer or steals from them, this channels the fury of dragon kind. You don't want to offend a dragon. That creature becomes off guard for 1 round. As written, I believe this takes effect even if the strike fails. When it's invoked, the bearer can, as a free action, fly up to 60 feet toward a creature that offended them in such a way. If they're next to that creature becomes off guard until the end of the rune bearer's next turn. Even if the rune bearer does not fly, they stay suspended in the air and land safely back to the ground at the end of their next turn. It's a very dramatic ability. All right, we get to the final tier, the level 17 runes. The first one is Ayuen, the Elfgate Key. This one's pretty cool. Once per turn, the rune bearer, whenever they take a stride action, they can instead teleport a distance equal to their speed. When you invoke it, you can teleport the rune bearer adjacent to any of your other runes, as long as it is on the same plane. If they're unwilling, they can make a will save to prevent that. Remember, you can only invoke runes within 30 feet of you, normally. I have to think there are interesting ways to use this tactically. You can put it on an ally who you want to be able to move around the battlefield, or you can put it on an enemy who you want to teleport next to your fighter who has their own rune that you can teleport them adjacent to, so that they have trouble getting away from that fighter. Also, if you have the sigil cantrip, you can teleport them adjacent to one of your sigils. And there's a level 1 Runesmith feat that lets you get this cantrip. And by this level, your sigils, your magical marks, are permanent. So you can have a lot of these marks throughout the universe, because it's the same plane, and let people teleport to any of those of your choosing. Last is Rovan, Seal of the Dead Vault. These are a form of the runes that keep the destroyer sealed in his prison. That's the god of destruction, Rovagug. It's drawn on a creature. You can do this on an enemy. You give them a minus 20-foot penalty to their land speed and a minus 40 penalty to all other speeds. If their fly speed is reduced to 0, they cannot fly. When you invoke this rune, you can try to trap them. The ground in a 10-foot emanation around the creature becomes difficult terrain permanently, and they must do a fortitude save. This has the incapacitation trait. You'll see why. If they succeed but don't critically succeed, they become slowed 1 for a round. If they fail, they're slowed 2 for a round, and if they critically fail, they're slowed 2, restrained, and blinded as they become trapped in a massive compressed sphere of earth. If they cannot escape within 3 rounds, I assume that's with the escape action against your class DC, which is not spelled out, then they become petrified. Over the course of a year, the sphere forms a small hill around it, hiding its buried prisoner, and at the top of the hill, a stone with the image of this rune remains. Someone can counteract the effect, and I assume Dispel Magic works on this. Once you attempt this super ability on a creature, they're immune for 24 hours. So before I go into the feats, I want to point out that this rune system gives you interesting choices in combat. You know 4 runes at low levels. Some of them can attack enemies, presumably, and some can support allies. You're choosing which runes to use in any given situation. You're also trying to figure out whether you want to use 1 action to trace a rune on an adjacent target, or 2 actions on a distant target. So your positioning in the battlefield is also important. You might want to spend actions moving around. And you can only trace or invoke runes within 30 feet. Meanwhile, the runes that you trace expire at the end of your next turn. If you want a combat long buff from one of your runes, you'll want to use one of your 2 etched rune slots that you have at level 1. All right, now we move on to the feats, and there are 34 of them. Again, I'm focusing on specific ones to give an idea of how the class works. I cover every feat in the Patreon video. Engraving Strike is a level 1 feat. Basically, you make a strike with a melee weapon, and if it hits, then you trace a rune onto the target of the strike. This sounds great, why not do it all the time? However, this requires actually hitting the foe. You're actually taking a risk, because if you just try to trace a rune on that foe, there's no check required. But if it lands, obviously, then you will have saved actions. Remote detonation's pretty cool. Basically, if there's a rune on an enemy, if you hit them with physical ammunition, say from a bow, you get to invoke the rune if it hits. In fact, you invoke all the runes on the target. A critical success on your strike gives the target a -1 circumstance penalty on their saving throws against the runes. This and the previous one are limited to once per round. So if you have this feat, you can spend 2 actions to trace a rune on a foe within 30 feet, and then try to hit them and blow up the rune while you're at it. Next is Rune Singer. This is a way to bypass the restrictions on tracing a rune. You sing your rune into being. You're limited to doing this once per minute, but when you do so, you don't need a free hand. It does not have the manipulate trait, and you can use the 2-action version with a single action. So with a single action, you can sing a rune onto a foe within 30 feet. You can also use your performance skill when you craft runes, so you whistle while you work, basically. Next is Fortifying Knock, a level 2 feat, which I covered briefly earlier. Once per round, you can, when you raise your shield, also trace a rune on that shield simultaneously. There's a number of feats that give you action compression, or remove or lessen the restrictions on tracing or otherwise using your runes. Vital Composite Invocation gives you a way to heal allies. It costs 2 actions, and you need to have 2 runes on a single creature already. One is divine and the other is primal. With 2 actions, you can invoke those 2 runes, and in addition to their usual effect, you heal the creature, your intelligence modifier, plus double your level. You can only use this once per 10 minutes, though. Alright, level 10 feats. Chain of Words. This one's a pretty cool one. You can invoke runes on any 2 rune bearers. They don't have to be allies, just any 2 creatures, so long as they're within 60 feet of you, so not the normal 30 feet. You invoke those runes, and in addition, there's a chain of glowing script that flows between them that does 5d6 force damage to all creatures in the line that does not include the rune bearers. They do basic reflex saving throws, and if anyone critically fails, they are restrained until the end of your next turn. That is the bad effect that prevents them from doing a whole lot of things, and they have to try to escape. This costs 2 actions, and it can only be used once per 10 minutes, but you can see a party that plans ahead and does a cool combo with this. Next is Clashing Composite Invocation. If there is a creature that has 2 runes of opposite tradition, so 1 arcane and 1 divine, or 1 occult and 1 primal, then you can spend 2 actions to invoke those 2 runes. But this also causes a destructive backlash that affects the rune bearer. They must do a fortitude save against the destructive magical harmonics. If they fail, they become sickened. If they succeed but don't critically succeed, they're still sickened 1, but an action automatically removes that condition. No check required. This can only be used once per 10 minutes, however. 14th level, Dance of Bloody Ink. This costs 3 actions, but this is super action compression. First, you need a melee weapon that has a rune on it. You invoke the rune and do whatever that does. Then you strike with the weapon. If you hit, you can then step and strike again with the same weapon, and if the second strike hits, you trace a rune onto the target of the strike. So that's 5 actions potentially for the cost of 3, and you don't increase your multiple attack penalty until this activity is over. And the theming is cool. Your weapon is your brush, wounds forming words of power in your target's flesh. Next is Define the Canvas. You whirl 4 rune-inscribed stones in the air, creating a 20-foot burst centered on your square. Again, I think it needs to be centered on a corner of your square, unless it's an emanation. But this is your canvas, and so long as you're in the canvas, whenever you trace a rune, it traces all creatures in the canvas that you choose. I don't think it affects items, however. The language says creatures. So basically all of the runes we saw that give you beneficial effects, you can make them apply to your whole party if you'd like. And remember, when you invoke runes, you can invoke as many runes as you want. You can make this canvas only once per 10 minutes, however. Next is Hengegate, which I think is very cool. You raise 2 standing stones within 30 feet of you, which must be within 15 feet of each other. They each occupy a 5-foot square. You apply one of your runes to the stones. And basically, if you or an ally fires ammunition in between the stones, it gains the benefit of that rune, and it automatically traces it on the target. So if you have an archer or two in your party, you can have them pepper a bunch of enemies with their arrows, and remember, when you invoke, you can invoke all runes at once, if they're within your range. Next is Return Unto Runes. This is a way to harness a spell attack against you and try to fling it back. As a reaction, if you are targeted by a ranged spell attack, and you need to have a hand free, of course, naturally, as a runesmith, then you try to deconstruct the incoming spell into its individual components. You get a +4 circumstance bonus to your armor class, and if it misses, the spell is returned to its original form sealed in a rune. It floats around you, and until the end of your next turn, you can trace this rune on a creature as normal. And when you invoke it, you affect the creature it is on, and presumably it's a bad effect if it was used to attack you. All right, and of course the level 20 feats we'll cover. We have Forge New Word. This lets you invent a new rune. It has the effects of any one common spell of 4th rank or lower that costs no more than 2 actions. So basically it gives you a 4th rank spell and pretty much do it at will. It costs an action to trace it and an action to invoke it. Its usage must match the target of the base spell. So if you want to affect an item, the spell needs to affect an item. If you want to affect a creature, it needs to target a creature. So I suppose this can be used for some choice spells, like the slow spell against an enemy. I'm sure people have other better ideas that people can share in the comments. The last feat is Shades of Meaning. You basically get to apply a diacritic rune to a base rune without spending any extra time. So you can trace a rune on a target in combat and apply a diacritic rune to it with a single action. So basically, if a foe is within 30 feet, you can spend 2 actions to trace a damaging rune on that enemy and apply a diacritic rune like this one that makes it explode in a 15-foot burst when it's invoked. You can use your 3rd action that same turn to invoke it. Oh, and by the way, the Rune of Fire at this level is going to be doing 20d6 damage. On to some final thoughts about the Runesmith. First, I think this is more evidence of a design direction that the designers are going in with Pathfinder 2e. I'll save my comments on that till the very end. First, I want to say that I like this playtest class. It can fight with weapons, but also infuse magic in their weapon fighting. And it's not just do more damage, like often happens when someone plays the Magus. Your magical effects can do a variety of things, including supporting your party members. And the decision space and how you use your actions and juggling your different effects all makes for interesting decisions, and it loves me my interesting decisions. I just thought there could be a little more clarity with the language in a few places that I pointed out. And also, I hope that there could be a balance pass. I think it may be a bit overtuned in a couple of places. For example, the first 2 runes that we covered, the Fire Rune and the Rune of Whetstones, the first does 2d6 fire damage, the next one does 2d6 slashing damage. If you start your turn next to an enemy, you can spend your first 2 actions to trace, well, first, the Rune of Fire on that foe, and then let's say you're wielding a sword. Your second action can apply the Rune of Whetstones to your sword. Then your third action can invoke both of them, because remember you can invoke any number of runes within range with a single action, and that foe is now subjected to 2 instances of 2d6 damage each, and must do 2 basic saving throws. Now, if they fail both of their saving throws, that's a total of 14 damage on average, which is not ridiculous. Martial characters can do that as well. However, you're not dealing with the multiple attack penalty, and you also have the versatility that having magical effects does. You can have different damage types, usually. And after recording, I realized that the damage scaling is quite rapid, more so than weapons. At least it seems so by my calculations. By 19th level, each of these runes does 20d6 or an average of 70 damage. And you have the assurance that you're probably doing some damage because they have to actually critically succeed on both saving throws in order to avoid all damage altogether. And if they critically fail against the fire one, they are dazzled for a round. And also on top of this, if that runesmith took the engraving strike feat at level 1, that lets them make a strike and trace a rune on the foe. If they hit with the strike, then, okay, let's start over. You can open your turn by striking the foe. If you hit the foe, you can apply the fire rune. Then action number 2, apply the Rune of Whetstone on your sword. And then action number 3, invoke both runes. Now you're doing one strike of weapon damage and applying 2 rune invocation effects, 3 sources of damage, and none of them are affected by the multiple attack penalty. Now, maybe the damage here is comparable to what a magus can do with a spell strike, where they combine their weapon damage in one of their spells. Someone will have to do the math on that. But what strikes me about this comparison is that while the magus puts all of their eggs in one basket, the spell strike basket, one single attack roll, if you have done what I just described, you have 3 baskets, and that has a lot of value. Average damage is only one metric. You also want to have reliable damage. And damage beyond what is needed to knock an enemy to 0 hit points is wasted damage from one point of view. Another scenario I thought of is that the N rune, the diacritic rune of expansion, which turns a damaging rune into a 15-foot burst effect when it's invoked, can turn this rune of fire into a mini fireball that scales just as well as fireball damage-wise, and it is at will. At level 9, a 5th rank fireball will do 10d6 damage. A runesmith can trace the fire rune on a foe and then turn it into this area effect with 2 actions and then move away. Now, this requires a little setup. Obviously, they're going to need a 4th action to invoke the rune. But you're doing a max rank fireball's worth of damage with this rune to an area, and you could do it any number of times per day. Now, someone should do an analysis. Maybe my concern is overblown here. Maybe there are fire kineticist abilities that are comparable to this. Also, there's the fact that the foes can scatter. They have warning that this bomb will go off. I'm just raising this scenario. Maybe it's too white room to make sure that there's some thought put into the balance. And honestly, my gut tells me it's all right because the foes can anticipate the danger. And the foe can actually insert themselves among your party so that you don't want to blow it up. Again, I overall like the class and I'm happy with this playtest. Plus, I think balancing damage is relatively an easy task, I would think, for designers than the other kinds of balancing that needs to be taken into consideration when creating a brand new class. All right, back to the point I want to make about Pathfinder 2e. Here's the Reddit post I made soon after making my video on the exemplar. I think the exemplar and the new classes, the necromancer and the runesmith, show Paizo going in the direction of having more powerful abilities that require some more planning and forethought to make effective. You cannot spam them at will like with weapon attacks and just say, I attack. And I think this shows the continuing influence of D&D 4th edition, which kind of had the same effect but through a different mechanic where they had more showy, flashy abilities, but their powers had cooldowns. You had encounter powers and daily powers. Instead of having a cooldown like that, we have restrictions like you can only do this once per round, or you have to set up this action by doing some actions before using it. We have this design space of quote-unquote spellcasting, but without traditional D&D Vancian spell slots, which were their own daily powers. We're getting away from strict cooldowns. Instead, Pathfinder has the advantage of having a 3-action economy and making players contend with the fact that some things require 2, 3, maybe even 4, 5, or 6 actions to pull off. Also, unlike D&D, these actions are exchangeable with each other. They're fungible. So you can have these interesting trade-offs because they're tradable with each other. We saw this approach earlier with Pathfinder's kineticist, where you had some impulses that might require 3 actions and or might overflow and cause you to lose your kinetic aura, which powers all of your impulses, so that you had to spend another action afterward to get your kinetic aura back. So instead of a situation like we see with other Pathfinder 2e classes and with D&D spellcasters, you're not tracking spell slots, and we don't see the situation with many D&D martial classes of tracking how many superiority dice you have between short rests, tracking how many rages you have, tracking how many key points you have. Instead, you're managing your resource of action points, let's call them, turn to turn. In the case of the kineticist, you can have a big showy power, but that weakens you temporarily. You have to manage the rhythm of your class from turn to turn, almost like managing breathing. Another thing we're seeing with these new designs is that you're being forced to think ahead. Just like the magic user in old D&D had to declare their spell and wait before their spell could fire off, you now have to, if you're an exemplar, place your divine spark in one of your icons and plan for it to trigger at some point later. If you're a necromancer, you need to decide now where to place your thralls and think ahead to when you're triggering them later. And here with the runesmith, you're deciding who you're going to trace runes on to set things up for later. The fact that this is trickier to manage means it's possible to give more raw power to these abilities, because that situation you want might not be there when you actually trigger the bomb. Plus the fact that it might cost more actions. Another thing that makes decisions more interesting now is that whenever you blow up the bomb, you lose some passive benefit. So we see this here with the runesmith. When you invoke one of those runes that's on your shield, you lose the passive benefit from that shield. This is reminiscent of how the exemplar works. When you use the transcendence ability of one of your icons and force your divine spark to move to another icon, you lose the first icon's passive ability and gain the passive ability of the new one. This is all much more complicated than I attack. And it's also, for many tactically minded players, more interesting. And also just leads to more cool moments, because the complexity of this decision making means that you can increase the power and drama of what you're doing, because it's harder to pull stuff off. You don't have simply one hammer to use on every nail, but you have a variety of tools at your disposal. Very specialized tools that make you want to find the perfect nail, the perfect problem for that tool to solve. This concludes my coverage of the Runesmith and the 2 classes that are now being playtested. The surveys are open through January 31st, and I encourage people to definitely participate, especially if you are playtesting the classes. They very much want feedback from those who actually see the playtest classes in action. So thank you for watching. So like and subscribe if you haven't already, and also support my Patreon, where I have bonus videos where I cover all of the feats and runes of this class and the Necromancer class. You also get ad-free early access to most of my videos and access to other exclusive content. And also join my Discord. I hang out there a lot. There are thousands of us. We discuss Pathfinder 2e and other gaming, and it's your chance to play Pathfinder 2e as well, because we have a drop-in, drop-out organized play system called Endless Tale Tavern. So that's it. I've been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I'll see you next time.